Episode 16, The Battle of the Route Coloniale 4. On the 20th of May 1950, starting around 6:45 a.m., the Moroccan infantrymen manning the French military post of Donké found themselves suddenly under a deluge of fire. Donké was a very important piece of the French system along the border between China and Vietnam. If you look on a map, Donké is bang in the middle between the towns of Cao Bang and Tat Khe on the RC4, that's the Route Coloniale 4, the road that hugs the Chinese border. This military post was a crucial stop for French convoys. That's where they stopped on their way to the furthest French garrison of Cao Bang. Vo Nguyen Giap's objective in May 1950 was therefore by taking Donké to cut the RC4 in two and to isolate Cao Bang to the west from Tat Khe, but also from the large French stronghold of Lang Son at the Aussie end of the RC4. In the days before the attack, without being detected, 4 battalions of the Vietnamese People's Army managed to hoist 75mm guns on the heights surrounding the town. And in a preview of the technique they would use at Dien Bien Phu, the Vietnamese opened up on the garrison, and for 48 hours, shells rained on Donké before waves of infantry swept through and overwhelmed the Moroccan defenders. Donké fell to the Vietnamese People's Army. But the French command reacted immediately. They dispatched 34 aircraft to the area and dropped a battalion of paratroopers on Donké. The paratroopers caught the Vietnamese soldiers by surprise, and they quickly reconquered the garrison, forcing the soldiers of the Vietnamese People's Army to withdraw to the jungle. This airborne operation was such a success that the French spent more time congratulating themselves than reassessing their vulnerable positions in the far north. For General Carpentier, this could have been the time to evacuate the frontier outpost, but he did not give the order. Maybe Carpentier thought that he had taught the Viet Minh a lesson, but Vo Nguyen Giap only called it a day because the rainy season was fast approaching. And as we know, you can't fight in North Vietnam between May and September. But this attack on Donké in May was like a probe. Giap saw what his forces could do in a more conventional battle. He had reinforcement he could have called in and counterattack, but he chose to withdraw to his secure Chinese rear base and bide his time. Hello, I have just given you a foretaste of our subject du jour. Today, we are going to talk about the famous Battle of the RC4, or if you want to follow DRV nomenclature, the Autumn-Winter Border Campaign. But before getting into it, thank you first of all for being here, and if you have not done so already, please subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to it. In addition, if you could leave a rating and a review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, it would go a long way to support my work. Again, thank you. If we get back to the Battle of Donké in May that I just told you, we can see that all the elements that would explain the French defeat in October were already visible in May. 1, the French posts along the Chinese border were too exposed. And secondly, the Vietnamese People's Army was not a ragtag guerrilla group anymore, but a proper force to be reckoned with. Let's start with the progress that the Vietnamese People's Army made. The man who we must now call General Giap had 250,000 men at his disposal in the spring of 1950. If you discount the regional troops and militias, there were 120,000 regular forces organized like a European army. there were 5 divisions based in Tonkin, that's North Vietnam, and the 325th based in Central Vietnam. Each division included 3 infantry regiments, an artillery battalion, and an anti-aircraft defense battalion, plus staff and support battalions. Their mission was to maneuver until they find the terrain and the conditions likely to neutralize the 2 French advantages of them. That is, 1, superior firepower, and secondly, air support. Only then were they to attack the French units. And it goes without saying that it was an incredibly complex task to keep these 6 divisions battle ready, when you think that the DRV did not have motorized transport. That's why the entire population in the Viet Minh zone was mobilized in the war effort, willingly or by force, thanks to a total social revolution. We will come back to this revolution in a later episode. Suffice to say that ZAP staff estimated that 50,000 peasants and porters were needed to meet the needs of a division on a combat mission. If you multiply that by 6 divisions, and the number of civilians mobilized is dizzying. And of course, women took on key roles on this effort. Because they were barred from combat duties, women served by thousands in the DRV bureaucracy, in healthcare, in assassinations, sabotage, and espionage missions, but also massively in logistics duties. So, after retreating from Dong Quai in May, General Giap retreated to China, and he took advantage of the monsoon season to prepare a big offensive in the autumn. What he intended to do was to strike the French where they were the most vulnerable, in the Chinese border. As a reminder, since Operation Léa in 1947, France maintained a certain number of border crossings along the RC4 between Lang Son to the east and Cao Bang to the west. And these military posts were not strategically important, and their protection mobilized troops that were much needed elsewhere, in the Red River Delta, for example. Last episode, we saw that General Revert recommended that they be evacuated. But for reasons mainly of prestige, France maintained garrisons on the Chinese border. And it was these isolated outposts that Giap intended to attack, because he believed that the time had come to move to a more offensive strategy. To prepare his troops, he trained them in real-size replicas of the outposts at Dong Quai, Cao Bang, and That Quai. Day after day, his troops relentlessly trained on how to storm these posts. But in that summer of 1950, the real key element that changed all the ballgame was the incredible amount of aid delivered by Communist China. The Chinese support made it to the Viet Minh faster than American aid to the French. Starting in June 1950, China supplied 14,000 firearms, 1,700 machine guns, 150 artillery pieces, 2,800 tons of cereal, as well as ammunition, uniforms, medicines, and communication equipment. At the same time, Vietnamese soldiers were being sent by the thousand to Yunnan for all kinds of military training. And these troops made it back in early September. Therefore, by the end of the rainy season of 1950, Vo Nguyen Giap had battle-ready units capable of going toe-to-toe with the French in conventional combat. Of course, he had neither armor nor aviation, but his units were now well-trained, well-armed, and well-supervised by Chinese advisors. But the question you might have at this stage is, why was the Chinese aid to the DRV arriving faster than the American aid to the French? To understand why, we need to consider the Bao Dai solution. After the recognition of the associated state of Vietnam by the US, Bao Dai tried to play the American card against the French. To do this, he appointed as Prime Minister an old constitutionalist from Cochin, China, who had a reputation of being an Americanophile. This guy's name is Nguyen Phan Long. After his appointment, Prime Minister Long immediately expressed the wish that American aid be supplied directly to his government and not to France. But of course, the French would have none of that nonsense. For example, the Commander-in-Chief, General Carpentier, told the New York Times that he would resign within 24 hours if the US military equipment was delivered directly to Bao Dai. France even went all the way and threatened the US to withdraw from Indochina altogether. If you provide your aid to Bao Dai, American France, we'll call it a day. We'll quit and let you fend for yourself. Come on, gentlemen, the Americans replied. We never considered for 1 minute giving arms to these Vietnamese. What are you talking about? These guys have neither generals nor colonels, not even majors. No, rest assured, messieurs, you have our full support. So Bao Dai and Mr. Long's maneuver failed. But what it did, that it delayed a little bit the delivery of American equipment badly needed by the French. In reality, it was only after the Korean War started, mid-1950, that deliveries of American equipment began to arrive. Most importantly, in September 1950, US President Harry Truman sent the Military Assistant Advisory Group, MAAG, to Vietnam to assist the French. Other equipment will then be delivered, including weapons, plus equipment of 12 Vietnamese battalions. Slow start, but American support would grow very fast and dwarf Chinese aid. Picture this. Between 1950 and 1953, the Americans provided 286,000 tons of equipment to the French, compared to 21,000 tons of Chinese aid to the DRV between 1950 and 1954. What the hiccups between Prime Minister Long, the Americans, and the French highlighted, though, was the fake independence of the Associated States of Vietnam. After only 3 months on the job, Prime Minister Long was dismissed by Bao Dai under pressure from the French. The French resented Long's pro-American and nationalist attitude and asked Bao Dai to replace him with somebody more proper. Well, Bao Dai obliged and replaced Prime Minister Long with a more French-compatible personality. This guy's name was Tran Van Hu. Mr. Hu was a French citizen and was very close to General Swan. The other major figure in the new cabinet was Nguyen Van Tam, whom we met in episode 10, Viet versus Viet. For Mr. Hu and Mr. Tam, the priority was to crush the Viet Minh. For them, they will cross the Independence Bridge when they get there. And in the local administrative field too, the independence of the ASV, the Associated States of Vietnam, did not change really a thing. The French did withdraw to the background and let the Vietnamese officials be the public figures, but they continued issuing instructions. Mai Elliott said that her father, who was then the mayor of Haiphong, complained that he had no power in front of these French people who held the money and gave him instructions to follow to the letter. So that is the political situation. Let us talk now about the French military situation. And the first thing to say is that France is on the back foot. There were now 250,000 men in the French Expeditionary Corps, and 40% were a mix of metropolitan troops, legionnaires, plus Algerian, Moroccan, and Senegalese infantrymen. The 60% was made of Vietnamese soldiers and auxiliaries. So this was a very diverse army, made up mainly of volunteers and from people coming from the whole French colonial empire. The Viet Minh understood this, and during the Battle of Dong Quai, they tried to convince the Moroccan soldiers to switch sides by putting loudspeakers and broadcasting the following message. Quote, "Friends of the 10th Moroccan Tabor, your situation is desperate. This war is unjust and you know it. Oppressed brothers, join our ranks. We will welcome you with open arms." End quote. The Expeditionary Corps was therefore on the back foot, and the least secure region remained the Route Coloniale 4 along the Chinese border between Langson and Caobang. This was a mountainous tropical forest full of narrow gorges and limestone cliffs, and the Viet Minh continued to set up many and deadly ambushes in there. The new French commander, General Carpentier, agreed with General Revert and wanted to evacuate the frontier posts. But not everyone in his staff saw eye to eye with the new general. General Alessandri, for example, who had been in Vietnam for a long time and who was commanding the forces in North Vietnam in Tonkin. Well, Alessandri described Caobang as, quote, an impregnable and strategic stronghold that considerably hampered communications between China and Vietnam, end quote. So it took time for the new general to convince the likes of Alessandri, but finally Carpentier decided in June 1950 that the posts in Dong Quai, Caobang, Tat Quai would be abandoned starting 16th of September. The operation was expected to be completed by mid-October 1950. Carpentier believed that Vo Nguyen Giap would not be able to attack before the end of the rainy season. But he was wrong. Indeed, on September the 16th, on the very day that the evacuation of Caobang was planned, the Vietnamese People's Army attacked the French positions in Dong Quai again. And that's how the autumn-winter border campaign began. It lasted from September 16th to October the 18th and ended in a crushing French defeat. The first episode was the Battle of Dong Quai, a remake of what took place in May. On September the 16th, 5 infantry battalions of the Vietnamese People's Army with mortar and artillery support attacked the Dong Quai post again, defended this time by 2 companies of the Foreign Legion. What followed was fierce fighting, and both sides suffered massive casualties. But after 2 days of combat, the post of Dong Quai fell into the hands of the Vietnamese, and only a dozen of legionnaires survived and reached Tat Quai about 20 kilometers to the south. The direct consequence of the fall of Dong Quai was that the whole Caobang's evacuation plan was thrown into disarray. First of all, the French could not recapture Dong Quai as they did in May. For one thing, General Giap was ready for it, so he would not be surprised this time. Secondly, it was still monsoon season, and you just could not send planes out there. What to do then? The French command first launched a diversion operation south of Caobang on the route Coloniale 3, hoping that Giap would divert troops there. But it didn't work. But secondly, General Carpentier decided to stick to the plan and continue the evacuation of Caobang. He ordered Colonel Charton, commander of the Caobang garrison, to evacuate on October the 3rd and to make for Langson via the route Coloniale 4. To do so, Charton had to go through Dong Quai, which, was occupied by Vietnamese soldiers. To solve this tiny issue, Carpentier assembled 3,500 troops in Tat Quai. Their assignment was to meet Colonel Charton and escort him back to Tat Quai. But now that Dong Quai was in Vietnamese hands, this force, under the command of Colonel Lepage, was given the additional mission of recapturing the town. That done, the Task Force Bayard, as it was codenamed, was to hold on to position by any means necessary to allow the people from Caobang to join them. Easy. Lepage left Tat Quai on September the 30th. But when he arrived around Dong Quai, his task force was unable to reconquer the town. The Vietnamese had erected many defensive positions around the town, and they were ready and waiting. They repelled all French assaults and launched counterattacks that annihilated several French units in a few hours. The French troops were harassed and attacked constantly between October the 1st and October the 5th. And they were on their own because bad weather prevented air support. Disorganized and decimated, short of food and ammunition, Lepage's men were forced to leave the route Coloniale 4 and sought refuge in a little basin called Coxa, west of Donké. But this refuge would turn out to be a trap. So Lepage was getting clobbered around Donké. Meanwhile, it was on October the 3rd that Colonel Charton reluctantly evacuated Caubin. Charton ignored the orders to abandon all heavy weaponry, and he embarked everything, even his artillery pieces. He had 2,600 soldiers and 500 civilians on his trucks. So this was a gigantic convoy, stretching for kilometers or miles if you wish. It even included the city's prostitutes. This convoy set off from Caubin, and almost immediately it ran into ambushes and blown up bridges, and the next day the convoy was blocked after covering only 14 kilometers. That's 9 miles for our American audience. So the Charton column therefore had to abandon its load and go off-road in the jungle. And in this oppressive jungle, the enemy was everywhere. French soldiers fell into one ambush after the other, and they were decimated. There were hundreds of dead, and the wounded were abandoned to their fate. It was a complete disaster. The Viet Minh troops were also exhausted and suffered heavy losses, but they had the wind in their sails. Colonel Le Kim, who was then a political commissar in the famous 308 Division, recounted the following, quote, "My superiors believed that the French units should be prevented from making their junction. So we continued our journey through the jungle for 3 days and 3 nights without eating almost anything." End quote. It was only on October 7th that what remained of the Charton and Lepage columns linked up. But at what cost? Remember that Lepage group had taken refuge in the Coxa Basin. In fact, they fell into a mega ambush. The legionnaires, Moroccan infantrymen, irregular Vietnamese troops gathered in Coxa were surrounded in the basin by 15 Viet Minh battalions. The only way out of there was a steep path monitored by a Vietnamese battalion. When they became aware of that, panic spread in the French ranks. People prayed in German, French, Italian, Hungarian, and Arabic. A few soldiers committed suicide by throwing themselves from the top of the cliffs. Frederick Lockwood says, quote, "The French force was disintegrating into a mob," end quote. At dawn on October the 7th, to break the deadlock, the Moroccan and legionnaires decided to storm out of the Coxa Gorge. Some managed to get through, but more than half of the men were killed. The few survivors of the Lepage column were therefore in a pitiful state when they joined the Charton column, which was in an equally deplorable state on a spot 100 meters from Coxa. To avoid total annihilation, the two colonels decided to divide the survivors into small groups and force their way to Tatke, 30 kilometers southeast of there. But it didn't work. Most of the troops were killed or captured in successive ambushes. The two colonels were also captured, and Charton was seriously wounded. At the end of the day, out of the combined 6,000 led by Charton and Lepage, only 600 men managed to reach the French line at Tatke. But these guys did not have time to catch their breath. The Vietnamese soldiers were on their heels, and it was every man to himself in Tatke. Tatke fell on October the 10th, after the Vietnamese obliterated a paratroopers battalion left in the rear guard. The Vietnamese soldiers then set off in pursuit of the survivors, who made for Lang Son, 60 kilometers to the southeast. But the Vietnamese People's Army had decided not to try to capture Lang Son just yet, because the town was just too big. But the French did not know that, and it was panic in Lang Son as well. So on October the 18th, the French abandoned the big town altogether. Lang Son, this old colonial town, so similar to little French provincial towns, was deserted. In the rush, no destruction was carried out by the French because the commanders said they did not want to attract attention. As a result, large quantities of weapons, ammunition, food, fuel, equipment, as well as vehicles were simply left there for Giap's troops to help themselves. By October 19th, 1950, there were no more French soldiers along the Chinese border. The French were shell-shocked. They had just lost 8 elite battalions. Again, out of a total of 6,000 at the start, 2,000 were killed or wounded and 3,000 were taken prisoners or missing. They had lost huge quantities of material, 8,000 rifles, 450 vehicles, for example. It was a rout. And the shock was also psychological. Until 1950, the French had underestimated General Giap and his troops. Well, not anymore. The Vietnamese, don't get me wrong, had lost many troops as well. Of the 30,000 Viet Minh soldiers thrown into battle, it is estimated that 9,000 of them died, which is colossal. But they were able to suffer massive losses without letting up the pressure. So a huge victory for Giap. To celebrate it, legend has it that he got drunk for the first time in his life with his Chinese advisors. General Giap owed his victory to 3 factors. 1, he had a numerical superiority of 3-1. 2, his military forces had made enormous progress into maneuvering and to combat. But 3, what made the difference above all was Chinese material and human support. Without it, Giap would never have been able to inflict such a stinging defeat on the French. So in the autumn of 1950, it was euphoria in the areas under DRV control. There were red ribbons everywhere on the houses, and the general atmosphere was that victory was within reach. Ngo Van Chieu, who wrote A Diary of a Viet Minh Fighter, recalls how the political commissars were saying everywhere that the People's Army would celebrate the Lunar New Year in Hanoi, and that it would be the gift to Ho Chi Minh for the Year of the Dragon. Next episode, however, we will see that Ho Chi Minh would not receive these New Year's gifts. Why? Well, because General Giap suffered a case of hubris and committed major blunders. But also because the French sent into Indochina one of their most distinguished warriors, Général Jean de l'Arc de Tassigny, nicknamed Le Roi Jean, King John. I therefore look forward to seeing you next time when Général de Tassigny makes his grand entrance on the Indo-Chinese stage. Until then, be well and goodbye.